What do you feel when you see me like this? How about now? It's weird how clothes can change people's perception of you, especially with a certain skin tone and facial hair. 7 years ago, I made a video about the movie Lwarence of Arabia and how the term Orientalism shows how Western cinema navigates how Middle Easterners are perceived negatively. I'm uploading the video again because I'm working on another video that shows how another movie can talk about the same thing, but in turn glorify people from the Middle East. And I think we need more of these movies. So in case you missed it, check out my first video.
Some of the biggest, most critically acclaimed Hollywood movies have this hero, an outsider from his own community who becomes part of an alien community where he is initially not trusted, but then ultimately saves it, and excels in that community's culture better than its own natives. David Sirota from Salon.com controversially writes, "These storylines insinuate that people of color have no ability to rescue themselves. This both makes white audiences feel good about themselves by portraying them as benevolent messiahs rather than hegemonic conquerors, and depicts people of color as helpless weaklings, all while wrapping such tripe in the cinematic argot of liberation." This cinematic narrative is evident across many genres, from the hip-hop drama 8 Mile to the groundbreaking science fiction of Avatar, as well as Dances with Wolves and Tom Cruise's The Last Samurai. It appears that Hollywood has always endeavored to appeal to its primary demographic, the white male. Such fictionalization and idolization of the key demographic is not necessarily a bad thing, as Hollywood is a business, and the primary goal of any business is to make money by selling an ideal or concept that is going to appeal first and foremost to our primary demographic. Putting a popular actor on screen simply sells more tickets. But what happens when Hollywood's cellular representation of history via the employing of this trope ultimately distorts the past to the point that fact and fiction are indistinguishable, and that fiction itself becomes the subject of celebration and admiration as a fact? Such is the case with the movie Lawrence of Arabia, a greatly admired biopic that tells a tale of a young British intelligence officer in World War I, who inspires and leads a revolt of the Arabs against the Ottoman Turks. Lawrence is in cinema theory what we can refer to as the typical white savior. The white savior narrative is a theme often employed in Western cinema, wherein a white character saves a community of people from a crisis. Hollywood fictions of whiteness labels the stories as fantasies that are essentially grandiose, exhibitionistic, and narcissistic. Lawrence's story and his role in the Arab Revolt via the way it's portrayed in Lawrence of Arabia is a prime example of this cultural narcissism, and what Edward Said has famously referred to as Orientalism. Here, the audience cheers for our hero who becomes one with the Arab culture, saving its people and ultimately saving the Middle East, in a manner that lacks authenticity. Based upon a piece of text that itself lacks credibility, his memoir Seven Pillars of Wisdom, Lawrence of Arabia's only achievement as a film is in its excellence in cinematography and set design, as well as the outstanding acting efforts of its talented cast. Unfortunately, just about every other component of this movie is appalling, overrated, and even damaging. There is a breathtaking scene at the beginning of 1998's The English Patient, the opening shot in fact, where a biplane flies over the dunes of the North African deserts, revealing its epic and sublime backdrop. This is the typical screen image Hollywood puts forward of the Middle East, no matter the time or era the film is set in. This beautiful and romantic view of our world is an unrealistic representational image of our region. It stems from the ideal movies like Lawrence of Arabia expound. This beauty is often dramatically compared with our exotic primal savagery, and is the first of many things that makes Lawrence of Arabia a dishonest and bad film. Initially banned in many Arab countries due to its negative portrayal of the Arab society as backward and brutal, the army T.E. Lawrence raises against the Turks is portrayed as a legion of undisciplined, dangerous, and borderline backward Bedouin tribes, while the Turkish themselves are depicted as inefficient, ruthless, and even sexually perverted. In reality, many of the Arab troops recruited for the insurgents were already trained military soldiers, who were once held in British POW camps. They wore British-style uniforms with kufiyas and fought in conventional battles. Furthermore, the film makes no mention of the Sharifian army, and leaves the viewer with the impression that the real-life Hashemite forces were comprised entirely of Bedouin volunteers. volunteers who were tamed and inspired by Lawrence to fight and win against the Turks. In the film, Prince Faisal, played by Sir Alec Guinness, is portrayed as a tribal chieftain, where in actuality he was said to be a very educated individual who had served as an MP in the Turkish parliament. The character of Odi Abutai, played by Anthony Quinn, is also depicted as an unreformed savage who cares only for violence, treasure, and his own self-image, where in real life he was thought of as a serious and intelligent leader who was influential in the strategic taking of Aqab. Apparently, Odi's family were so deeply offended by the portrayal of him in this film, they had spent years trying to sue its producers. Played by Omar Sharif, the character of Sharif Ali, the most famous Arab personality in this film, is a purely fictional character, made up of a composite of several Arab leaders who Lawrence interacted with at that time. Sharif Ali is by far the most problematic, as he is initially shown as a greedy, barbarous, and cruel man, whose uncivilized nature is a product of his desert and Islamic upbringing, and remains so throughout the majority of this feature. Gradually, under the influence of Lawrence, he becomes more enlightened and humane in his attitude, beginning to care for his men on a human and empathetic level. This character portrayal and interaction is consistent with Edward Said's explanation of Orientalism. According to his idea, Orientalism is a power relation that not only extremely narrows the scope of Oriental reality, but also perpetuates a self affirming Western bias. The West built an emotional, less ordered image of the East by depicting its culture as essentially highly sentimental and mysteriously sensual, that is waiting for a formal, rational, and masculine West to rescue it. The sexual assault of T. E. Lawrence by Turkish soldiers remains one of the most controversial aspects in his life both on screen and off, with some 21st century scholars now saying that both versions of the events, the first recounted in his memoir Seven Pillars of Wisdom, and then in its cinematic portrayal in Lawrence of Arabia, as being entirely a work of fiction. Until now, scholars have been unable to ascertain Lawrence's whereabouts during those critical days where he had claimed that he had been captured in Daraa by the Turkish governor Hajim Bey, then whipped and raped by his guards. Yet, evidence uncovered by James Barr, the author of Setting the Desert on Fire, T. E. Lawrence, and Britain's Secret War in Arabia from 1916 till 1918, suggests that Lawrence never even went to Daraa. For various reasons, him and other historians consider the whole Daraa incident a fabrication, partly because of the sensual way the incident was written about in the memoir, and partly because he was seen by eyewitnesses looking unharmed afterwards. Although in the grand scheme of things the true nature of T. E. Lawrence's sexuality and bisexuality are to some degree irrelevant, the hypersexualization of non-white males across various forms of media is as old as media itself. From classical colonial literature to the latest hip-hop video, the exaggerated masculinity of ethnic men, whether Middle Eastern, Black, or Hispanic, is done in a manner to make their image both feared yet desired, and even admired, despite in itself being an entirely manufactured fantasy created by the admirer. Such desires that make up the fantasies of Lawrence perhaps became the source of the eroticized content of his memoir. Fantasies that were influenced by the stereotypes ethnic and Middle Eastern men have, and our apparent primal sexual ferocity and uncontrollable urges, recorded for his own personal titillation as fact. While there is some degree of truth to the overall narrative of Lawrence of Arabia, many scenes were either heavily fictionalized or did not even happen, like the raid in Daraa. Scenes with the Arab Council were wide off the mark, inasmuch as the Council remained more or less in power in Syria until France deposed Faisal in 1920. While the plot premised that Lawrence's Arab army was almost completely deserted has been debunked as completely fictional. Furthermore, the role Lawrence played in the Arab revolt against the Ottomans has been exaggerated to the point that instead of reflecting the reality of what really occurred, the sequence of events have been recut and edited to suit the trope of the white savior. In reality, Lawrence was not alone in his efforts to help defeat the Turkish presence. Instead, he was one of several successful British and French intelligence officers operating in the region. Clearly, much of the issues Lawrence of Arabia has as a piece of work is not due to the actual historical events, but the unreliable source of material, Seven Pillars of Wisdom. However, the fault does not rest there, as Lawrence had always been known to be a self promoter who exaggerated and romanticized his exploits. Thus, the fault primarily rests with the movie's director, writers, and producers, who have chosen to make a cliched work of fiction and promote it as a historical fact. The based on a true story theme that many a film have employed since then is a severe negative in Lawrence of Arabia, as it belittles the achievements of the Arabs themselves, especially Faisal. Both the efforts of him as well as other individuals, whether Arab or non Arab, involved in the real life events this movie claims to portray have been reduced to a metaphorical footnote or totally expunged from the real life narrative altogether. Ultimately, Lawrence of Arabia is far from being a historical biopic about one man's efforts during World War I, and is more of an adaptation of a work of fiction, dressed up as a memoir, written by an unreliable narrator and marked and remembered as fact. Film critic Bosley Crowther criticized the film for becoming heavily involved in sullen delusion and political deceit, while Andrew Saris remarked that its aim was to intimidate its audiences rather than educate or even entertain them. As eloquently stated by a historian on telawrencestudies.org, it is one thing to argue that historical fact may be sacrificed for the benefit of dramatic art. However, it is quite another to disregard historical fact altogether. The shame is that such magnificent landscapes, acting, direction, photography, editing, music, and all of the other technical skills were let down by a bad script.